Hey guys, you're watching Let's Talk About Prepping. I'm Tyler, your host, and in today's video, we're going to have a bit of a chat. And if you want to jump right to that conversation, it'll be at this timestamp here. But first, I want to share with you guys these sheet metal toy models that I've been enjoying lately, and which I plan to use for a little bit of background footage here and there. These are somewhat like the balsa wood models that you might have built when you were younger, but these are laser engraved on thin metal sheets. They're very fine detailed, but they're very fun to put together and pretty cathartic. Now, they come in the usual styles of things like planes and vehicles, but also in some modern styles, like Star Wars or current spacecraft. I've even got a dragon. It's one of the more complex ones, and it's taken me quite a while to put together. The one that I've chosen today is the Freightliner semi-truck tractor. And I've chosen that because out of all the ones at my toy store, it really spoke to the prepper in me. Semi trucks are the backbone of our distribution network, and without them, our entire system starts to collapse. So I think it'll be a good one to put together, and I hope you guys agree. Now, I don't get anything sponsor wise from these guys. These are just some fun toys that I found in my local toy store, and I like to share with people who have kids who are in the appropriate age range. If your kids are a little too young, I imagine that they could watch while you put this together, and it'd be a really fun learning experience and burn in some good neural pathways in their little brains. Now, like I said, this is fun for both kids and adults. It teaches a special kinds of patience because you're sitting there for hours paying attention to fine details and trying not to get frustrated, mostly with yourself. It teaches a lot of attention to instructions because if you miss an instruction, you might ruin the entire thing. A lot of intricacy, dexterity, and attention to detail because you're doing some very fine motions with things like tweezers and stuff like that. So I just think it's a very valuable source of entertainment. And because they're so small, if you have the money to buy quite a few of these, they could stash very well. And even though you can only build them once, you can still enjoy them afterwards. And in that vein, it will teach children to treat their things well because these will not last long if they're abused. And so, getting some of these for your kids to teach them the lessons of treating their things with respect so that they'll last a long time could be a good option. Anyways, I hope that this will be an interesting thing to have in the background for some videos. I really enjoy putting these together. Uh, if you want to get a few, probably going to be at your local toy store like I found them, definitely online. I'm sure that there's different brands, and I hope that you find it interesting. Anyways, let's get into our conversation for today. The topic of today's conversation is your perspective on prepping. And I don't mean why you prep or what got you started on prepping, but how do you imagine the situations that you're going to prep for? Or how do you imagine using your preps? I'm talking about in the form of a narrative, in the first person, second person, third person perspective. Now, this is a little abstract, but bear with me. In the first person narrative, you are talking about something that you have experienced. You are relating what happened to you. I went to the place. I will do this. In the second person narrative, you are describing directly to the person what they did or are doing or will do. You go down the stairs and it is dark down there, so you turn on the light switch. In the third person perspective, you are describing somebody else. Tyler went down the stairs and turned on the light switch to another person altogether. Now, we all imagine things and tell ourselves our own life story from various different perspectives, but rarely is this in the first perspective. While we experience things in the first perspective, we don't often imagine ourselves in the future or in an imagined situation in that same perspective. Part of this is because how our brain works, it's easier for us to think of things in an abstract way in the form of a story. That's why sometimes the way that we expect things to happen turns out quite differently in reality, because Somewhere along the line, in imagining how things will occur, we've given ourselves the benefit of the doubt of an ideal situation, like in a storyline, rather than subjectively putting ourselves in our own shoes in that future situation. And while this is usually just fine because the reason that we think about these things in these future situations in our mind is mostly to try to settle our own worries over these situations and not necessarily to build an effective uh, plan of action for those situations. But when we're talking about life and death situations, like the emergencies that we often talk about in the prepping community, it's very important to pay attention to how we choose to think about these situations. It's very important to analyze whether we're thinking of ourselves in a future emergency situation from the perspective of an ideal storybook situation in which we're able to respond to things better than we're able to respond to them currently, or whether we're being realistic with ourselves about the level of training and preparedness that we will have in various situations in the future. It's all well and good to try and imagine yourself in a future situation like an EMP and ascribe to yourself the skills that you plan to have trained by that time. But it's also very important to be realistic with yourself about whether or not you will have those skills and whether or not you'll be able to do all the things that you tell yourself you'll be able to do in an emergency situation. For instance, if you are not readily gaining medical knowledge, it's very important to begin preparing to either have that medical knowledge for yourself or find some other way to have your medical needs covered. It's not enough to tell yourself that by the time an emergency comes around, you will have found a medical person to add to your prepper group, because that might just be wishful thinking if that emergency comes in the next year or so and you haven't done anything about it. For this reason, and for many others, I think it's very important to ask yourself, am I imagining myself in a fairy tale situation in the future which may never come to fruition? And am I working to get myself in that situation? Or should I be more realistic with myself about what things will really be like 1 year from now or 2 years from now? And most importantly, am I being realistic with myself about how I will use my preps and what I will do in response to the various emergencies that I will be likely to face? I feel that many preppers prepare for the imagined situations that they have heard talked about on YouTube and in blogs and movies over and over again. They fulfill the checklists and they do the things that they have heard spoken about repetitively, but they haven't necessarily spent the time to sit there and think about how they will feel and what they will do in the minute to minute time in the midst of an emergency. What will you do in the endless hours as you bug out or as you bug into your home once you have blacked out your windows and basically cut yourself off from the outside world? What then? What will you do to while away the hours? Or if you bug out and you find yourself sitting on a log in the hills in the middle of nowhere, what will you do next? What will you do to fill your time? Do you know how to schedule all the things that you will need to do minute by minute in a survival situation? Are you aware that almost every minute counts when you are bugging out in the woods? The minute to minute things are the things that will get you killed in a survival situation because they're the things that are likely not prepared for. A pallet of MREs and stacks of rice and silver are all well and good, but you will begin to find all the tiny holes and cracks that your time and energy will pour through if you haven't spent a lot of time considering the minute to minute aspects of future situations. And so, for that reason, I hope that my perspective on the first, second, and third person narrative of how you imagine your future and your response to emergency situations will seem a little bit relevant to the way that we prepare for the future.
I think it's very important to analyze the way that you think about prepping and to keep a crystal clear and relevant perspective on how you will respond and what the reality of your situation will look like in the emergency situations that you are most likely to face. Because all of the preps that you can make in the world may do you no good if they're founded on faulty logic and imaginary situations which are nothing like the reality that you end up facing. Anyways, I hope that this was an interesting conversation. I hope that it's relevant to you, and if you have any thoughts, please definitely share them in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and if you have any thoughts on the sheet metal model toys, also share those. Thanks for joining in, guys, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Everybody, stay safe out there.